Hello friends, and welcome to another episode in the teaching series. I cannot wait to jump in to what we're going to talk about today. But something I just wanted to mention up front, and particularly for those of you who are new to the teaching series, is I just wanted to make you aware of a free ebook at walkingthetext.com called The Number One Mistake Most Everyone Makes Reading the Bible. And in that, there is a graphic that walks us through the 6 different lenses with which we want to set a text into its ancient context. And for the rest of you who have been watching this teaching series or you've been listening to the teaching series, you'll notice that probably maybe every 4 or 5 episodes I reference this. But this is what's actually guiding every single teaching that I do. And I just wanted to remind you that this resource was there and it walks through what are in each of these 6 different lenses, because today's teaching is coming out of the literary lens. And inside that literary lens, I talk about how knowing what books of the Bible were composed when and by who really helps you string together stories that actually transcend different books and letters in the Bible. And so today's lesson is going to help us to get to the lesson based on this literary approach to understanding the text we're going to look at in its ancient context. And so I just want to remind you that that's there and that this is guiding the whole teaching series. All right, here we go. Colossians. I love the letter that Paul wrote to the people of Colossae, which is what we call Colossians. Paul wrote it in roughly 60 AD. On a map here, he's actually imprisoned in Rome, and he's riding over here to what is known as Asia Minor in the ancient world, present-day Turkey. And if we kind of zoom in here, you can get a sense for where Colossae is. It's in connection to these other 2 cities of Hierapolis and Laodicea, and this is what the Tell of Colossae, it's an unexcavated site today, looks like. But the letter that Paul writes to these people, he's actually never met them. Now, this is on a major thoroughfare through Asia Minor, and Paul spends a lot of time in Asia Minor, but he's never been to Colossae. He actually references that in chapter 2 of this very short letter. It's just 4 chapters that Paul writes to this ancient Jesus community at the city of Colossae. And in chapter 4, Paul does what he often does in the letters. He's got kind of these greetings at the very end where he's, greeting the people and he's saying, hey, here are my friends, or here are my fellow coworkers, or, here are people who are in prison with me. They send you their greetings. They send you their love. And in chapter 4, verse 10, we read this. Paul's writing and he says, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabbas. You have received instructions about him, talking about Mark. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, if you just pick up the letter of Colossians and you just read through it, you go, well, that's nice for Paul to say, until you're brought into the backstory, because there is a backstory to why Paul says this. And the backstory in many ways really picks up steam with what is known as Paul's first missionary journey. In fact, when he launches that missionary journey, or maybe more biblically to say the Holy Spirit launches it, his name is Saul, and his name will become Paul in this first missionary journey. And this is back in probably right around 47 AD, so about 13 years before this letter of Colossians. We are invited into this first missionary journey, is what we call it, where Paul and Barnabas and a guy by the name of John Mark set off from the ancient city of Antioch. And Antioch is inside this Asia Minor square here. If we kind of zoom in here, you have Antioch here on the very far right side of the photo of this map, known as Syrian Antioch or Antioch on the Orontes. And so At this point, Barnabas and Saul and John Mark, they go from Antioch down to Seleucia, which Seleucia is the port city, and they sail to Salamis, which is on the island of Cyprus. And then it says that they made their way around to an area called Paphos, and there's a very interesting story there. And then they shoot straight up into Asia Minor proper, if you will, to a place called Perga. And here's a photo of what Perga looks like today. It's just these amazing ruins at the ancient city of Perga. But notice here in Acts 13:13, what is said happens the moment they arrive at Perga. It says, from Paphos, Paul and his companions, talking about Barnabas and John Mark, sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. And that's all we're told. It doesn't tell us why he left. Doesn't tell us, is Paul and Barnabas upset? It just says he left them, and that's all we get. And the missionary journey continues, and some other events happen. And then you have what is known as the Acts 15 Council. And the Acts 15 Council happens in roughly maybe 49, maybe 50 AD. So it's a couple years, 2-3 years after this event happens. And the question that you ask in the midst of just this story is, how big of a deal was this to Paul? And we find out on the back end of the Acts 15 Council, because in Acts 15, we read this. Sometime later, this is after the Acts 15 Council, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take them because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. So how big of it was a deal for Paul that John Mark left back in Perga in the first missionary journey? A really big deal. He and Barnabas have this really tight-knit relationship, and they actually part company. Now, I believe that there might be something going else on there. They did part company, but how it occurred and what I think actually may have happened in that moment, I think there's some events and acts that are kind of giving us hints that way, but that's a different teaching for a different day. They eventually got to a point where they agreed to disagree, and Barnabas and John Mark went one direction, and Paul and Silas went another direction, and you realize, man, something happened in that moment that even a few later, Paul is like, we cannot trust John Mark. I don't want him in the same, boat. Actually, they're not going to go in a boat. They're going to walk, and maybe they didn't even know at this point when they were getting ready to do this where they were going. But Paul's like, no, we're not going to do this. And that's what makes this passage in Colossians 4 just absolutely astounding, because this is now 10 years after Barnabas and Paul had this sharp disagreement about John Mark, and Paul just references this in his greetings that, listen, if Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, comes to you, you welcome him. And you go, man, something happened in the relationship between John Mark and Paul for Paul to say this. In fact, there's even a happier ending in Paul's very last letter. And this might have been in 66, 67, 68 AD, so 6, 7, 8 years after Paul writes this letter to the people of Colossae. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4:11, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. So at the very end, the very last letter that we believe Paul wrote is that he's saying, I want Mark now. Like, we've reconciled, like he's useful to me. We got a great relationship. I need him. I want him here at the end of my story. And it's just really, really, really cool. But there's something else going on in Colossians 4:10. That when Paul says this about when Mark, if he comes to you, welcome him. This is not only astounding because in light of the rest of the stories and the rest of the narrative, but what Paul has just done one chapter prior here in Colossians. Because in Colossians chapter 3, Paul is writing about all these instructions about how these followers of Jesus ought to live their life as a result of coming into relationship with Jesus. And in the midst of these commandments, something just really stands out that is powerful in the moment, but it becomes super powerful in light of what happens in chapter 4. And Paul just says this. He says, bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. That Paul, in the midst of this, says you ought to be forgiving one another. And then in chapter 4, Paul says what he says. And all of a sudden, there is this truth that comes screaming to the surface. It's a truth that we've probably all heard before, and maybe some of us many times, but I feel like it's just worth bringing out in the midst of what's happening in this letter that Paul writes to the Colossians about his relationship, what I believe he's referring to in John, with respect to John Mark, even in Colossians 3. Is just this idea that we cannot ask others to do what we're not willing to do ourselves. That as leaders, as parents, as people who are on teams, who lead teams, who are leading children, who are doing all different types of things, whatever God has gifted us to do, I would imagine we are all in a place where we have influence over someone else. And the question becomes, is that do we live our lives in such a way where we're asking other people to do things that we're not willing to do ourselves? That I think that what Paul is getting at in the midst of this letter when he's talking about forgiveness, and then he mentions the whole thing about John Mark, is I think Paul is saying, I'm not going to ask you to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. And let's just be frank, forgiving someone who has deeply wronged us is one of the hardest things that we do in life. I mean, we know how hard it is to forgive others when they've done something to us. And Paul goes, listen, I'm not going to ask you to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. And I think this is just a huge leadership lesson, life lesson that we just need to continue to be reminded of. And then this is at the heart, too, of the whole Christian story. So this is what I so love about the book of Hebrews, is that in a couple of places, the writer of Hebrews reminds us just even how Jesus interacted with becoming human and how we can now relate to him because he's demonstrated he walked in our shoes and he understood our world. In Hebrews 4:15, the writer just says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. That there's never a point in our journey where we're struggling with something that we can basically say to Jesus, you don't understand. Jesus goes, no, actually I do understand. I took on flesh and blood. I entered into the human experience. I became fully human in order to walk out the story, to demonstrate it can be done, and to let you know that I understand what you're going through, and I'm not going to ask you to love your enemies if I'm not willing to demonstrate doing that myself. That I'm not going to tell you pray for those who persecute you if I'm not going to be willing to do that myself. I'm not going to tell you to lay down your life so that others can live if I'm not willing to do that myself. Over and over and over again, Jesus went through all sorts of things in order to accomplish God's will in his life, and he did so in the power of the Holy Spirit. But he's also doing it as a way of saying, I understand what it is to walk in your shoes. I can empathize with your situation. And that just helps me so much in my journey. And then to know that the same Holy Spirit that animated the life of Jesus and his ministry, who rose him from the dead, is the same Holy Spirit that God has graciously given to us in order to live out what he's called us to do. And so we're called to set the example. We're called to do these things, and we're called to do it in a way where we're setting the example, where we go first, where we're not going to live our lives in such a way where we're telling other people, yeah, you ought to do this and you should do this, but we're not willing to do that ourselves. This is something that Paul understood. This is something that Jesus understood. And I believe that this is just a huge life lesson that we need to continue to embrace on a regular basis. That when it boils down to it, friends, you go first. I go first. I'm not going to ask my family to do things that I'm not going to be willing to do myself, or even to demonstrate first and foremost what this looks like. In fact, several years ago, I remember talking with one of my mentors. And it was just one of those really informative conversations that we had. And in the midst of the conversation, he said, Brad, you know what? He says, I will never teach something that I haven't wrestled with for at least 6 months. And he says, I just don't ever want to invite someone into something that I don't know for certain is 100% true. And I remember that conversation having such a huge impact on me that I made a vow that day that I would never teach anything that I wasn't certain was true, that I felt it in the depth of my soul and my bones. And I can tell you that in this teaching series, I will never teach you anything that I just came up with last week, or that I really haven't delve into and said, is this true? I don't want to invite you into anything that I'm not certain is truth. I don't want to just pitch you a really great idea, because ultimately I'm inviting you to try things out, and I believe that there's something to them. And this was because I had a mentor of mine who went first, who said, listen, I'm going to set that example. And I'm like, well, I want to pattern that example. And now I'm trying to set that example for other people. And I think for all of us, that as we think through our lives, as we think through the people who we have influence over, those who we do life with, those who we're raising, those who we're connected to, is that like Paul, like Jesus, we live with this reality that we go first, and that we don't want to ask others to do what we're not willing to do ourselves. That is what makes that passage, in my opinion, in Colossians 4 so ridiculously powerful. So friends, thanks so much for stopping by. As always, I hope you're finding these teachings to be helpful, to be thinking through and wrestling with. You can head over to walkingthetext.com if you're watching or engaging this anywhere other than at Walking the Text. I'm going to have a list of questions for you just to continue to think through, to take this teaching deeper, to think about how we may live this out in our own stories, and how we can mitigate trying to make others do things that we're not willing to do ourselves. So we just love your thoughts. Feel free to leave comments there if you know someone who just needs to hear this teaching. As always, please share that with them. Again, thanks for stopping by, and may you walk out the text well in your life.